All right, everybody, we are on our second to last chapter, which is the reproductive system. This will make up the next bulk of your exam outside of the digestive system, but I will still try to highlight the most important things for you. And as always, I will provide a study outline to go along with the chapter. All right, so our initial distinction for our reproductive organs is broken down into primary and secondary. So the primary sex organs are also referred to as the gonads. And so they're primary sex organs because they produce and house our sex cells, which are known as gametes. So in males, this is the testes. In females, this is the ovaries. Our secondary sex organs are going to provide the route by which sex cells unite. So these will vary by sex. So we have in the males, there's a system of ducts and glands, as well as the penis, which make up the secondary sex organs. In females, we have secondary sex organs such as the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, and really their job is to house and kind of unite the egg and sperm, as well as provide an environment for growing a healthy egg. So we're going to talk about the male reproductive system first. So it serves to produce, transport, and introduce mature sperm into the female reproductive tract. Okay, so the testes lie within the scrotum. And so these organs are going to be what manufacture our sperm and produce our primary male sex hormone, testosterone. So extending all the way from the abdomen to each testicle is the spermatic cord. And this kind of provides a covering for everything, everything including our testis itself, the epididymis, the vas deferens, and then our network of arteries, veins, and lymph vessels. So the vas deferens is a sperm duct that lies within this cord. So it is not what produces sperm. We'll talk about that on our next slide, but it really stores the sperm in the spermatic cord. So a little bit more of a zoomed in view inside the testes. So if you take a look at where this bracket is, or kind of these subsections here, those are known as lobules. And within each lobule are 3 seminiferous tubules, and that's where our sperm is actually produced. Lying in between these tubules is what's known as Leydig cells, and they produce our testosterone. So the seminiferous tubules are where sperm is produced. You can remember that semen contains sperm, so it's produced in the seminiferous tubules. And then the Leydig cells are what produce the hormone testosterone. There's also the epididymis that lies kind of around the testes here. And you'll see, so the true path of sperm is that it's going to be produced in our seminiferous tubules. It's going to pass through the rete testis into the efferent ductule, and then down into the epididymis, which will then transport it to the vas deferens. Okay, so we're going to touch on spermatogenesis, or how our sperm are actually formed. So you don't need to know every single detail of this process, but it is good to know the gist here. And one of the important things that you'll see as we go through this is that our spermatogonia, which is what's considered kind of like a primitive sex cell, starts with 46 chromosomes, and we get all the way down to our spermatozoa and our spermatids. They only have 23 chromosomes. So let's start. I'm going to say start at the top, but really this is the basement membrane or bottom membrane of our seminiferous tubules, and we work towards the opening or the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. So as I said, our primitive sex cell is known as the spermatogonia. It starts up top here with 46 chromosomes. It's going to divide via mitosis to produce 2 daughter cells. So if you remember mitosis, that's cell division. And so the daughter cells are also going to have 46 chromosomes. The daughter cell will mature and get slightly larger, and it becomes what's known as a primary spermatocyte. So those, like I said, still we have 46 chromosomes. That's important to keep track of. And so as we kind of mature and divide and grow, we are moving farther from the basement membrane and closer to the lumen. So now the primary spermatocyte is not going to go through mitosis to divide. It is going to go through meiosis, which is a special type of cell division for sex cells. So when we go through meiosis of the primary spermatocyte, we're going to have two secondary spermatocytes with 23 chromosomes each. And these are going to be genetically unique. They are not identical. That's why you and your brother and sister, unless you're identical twins, do not look the same, even though you came from the same mother or father in that case. So our secondary spermatocytes are going to divide again to form what are known as spermatids. These spermatids are going to differentiate to form heads and tails, and they will eventually mature into spermatozoa, which is the full name. We always refer to these as sperm, and they are going to have 23 chromosomes. So I would say the average person, or unless you have some type of genetic disorder, you have two pairs of 23 chromosomes, so 46 chromosomes total. So the sperm will have a set of 23 chromosomes, and the egg will have a set of 23 chromosomes. So when they combine again, that will form 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, this just shows the head of the spermatozoa, so it's a little bit of a zoomed in view. So we have our head that actually contains, sorry guys, my computer's being a little funny. That actually contains the nucleus of our sperm. The middle piece here is where our mitochondria lies. And so that's where our energy is. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And then the tail is what actually provides mobility. So that's known as a flagella. Okay, the semen itself is going to consist of 65% of its volume comes from the seminal vesicle. Another 30% is going to come from our prostate gland, and another 5% is going to come from what's known as our bulbourethral gland. But you should know that a large majority of it is going to come from the seminal vesicles. In a typical ejaculation, 2 to 5 milliliters of semen will be ejaculated, which contains 40 to 100 million sperm. So a whole bunch of sperm. All right, let's talk a little more about the vas deferens itself again. Remember, this is our sperm storage center within the spermatic cord. So that vas deferens travels through the spermatic cord into the pelvic cavity, and it goes over to the ureter, which runs from our kidney to our bladder, remember. So it's going to travel over that ureter through the prostate and end up sitting kind of behind our bladder. So the vas deferens turns downward and it joins in with our seminal vesicle, and that is what forms the ejaculatory duct. So back this way. It's going to go up, over, around, and it's going to join with our seminal vesicle and the ejaculatory duct. You see our prostate gland is right there as well. And so that's where it can supply its portion of fluid for the semen. So each testis has a ejaculatory duct. So males have 2 ejaculatory ducts. As I said, it passes through the prostate as well, and it will empty into the urethra. Okay, so question 1, where is testosterone produced? Is it A, the seminiferous tubules, B, the interstitial cells of the testes, C, the epididymis, or D, the sustentacular, or also known as Sertoli cells? So the answer here is B, the interstitial cells of the testes, also known as Leydig cells. So remember, our seminiferous tubules are the ducts in which sperm are actually produced, where spermatogenesis takes place. The epididymis is a place for the sperm to mature, and it holds it until it passes up to the vas deferens. The Sertoli cells supply actual nutrients to our sperm. I know we haven't talked about those in depth at all. And they secrete the hormone known as inhibin, and that plays a role in maturation. But don't worry too much about Sertoli cells right now. Okay, some accessory glands of the male reproductive system. So at the base of the bladder, we have a pair of seminal vesicles. We just talked about how our vas deferens goes up and around to meet with the seminal vesicle. That actually secretes a thick yellowish fluid into our ejaculatory duct. We have our prostate gland. Remember, that sits just underneath that seminal vesicle and ejaculatory duct. It encircles the urethra and the ejaculatory duct. It has a thin, milky, basic fluid that travels into the urethra, and it just somewhat adds volume to the semen. We also have what's known as our bulbourethral gland, or another name for those is the Cowper's glands. And remember, that's a small portion of the semen. It secretes a clear fluid into the penile portion of the urethra. So the urethra is kind of broken up into the bladder portion here and the penile portion. And so that only occurs during sexual arousal. That's when the Cowper's glands contribute their fluid. It's a lubricant for sexual intercourse, but it also neutralizes the acidity of the residual urine in the urethra, which would kill our sperm. We obviously do not want that. And that's another reason why the prostate gland's fluid is a bit alkaline. Okay, so question 2, where does sperm begin development? Is it A, the seminiferous tubules, B, the seminal vesicles, C, the vas deferens, or D, the epididymis? So A, the seminiferous tubules. The seminal vesicle secretes fluid to help form the fluid portion of the semen. Remember, the vas deferens is going to carry the sperm from the epididymis to the ejaculatory duct, so it's more of our storage center. And the epididymis is also a storage center more within the kind of right next to the testes rather than up in the spermatic cord. Okay, moving on to the female reproductive system. So this just gives a bit of an overview of the different organs that make up the female reproductive system. You see our uterus is up here. You have the ovary, which is your primary sex organ, the fallopian tube, which transports the egg from our ovary to our uterus. This round ligament that kind of helps maintain the position of our uterus. You have the bladder itself that lies almost underneath the uterus and in front of the vagina. The urethra, you'll see this is much shorter than the urethra in males, which is part of the reason why women have much higher rates and risk for UTI. And then you have the vagina opening itself, which extends all the way up to the uterus. It's going crazy on me, guys. Okay, so we're going to talk about the ovaries a little bit more in depth. So this kind of gives an overview of the different step-by-step process that it goes through to actually become not only an egg, but once fertilized, what kind of the next couple of steps are. This YouTube video is a good one just to walk you through step-by-step. And it's also on page 473 of your book that it goes through it a bit more. I don't think I included a slide to walk. Yeah, okay, so let's go through it together with our diagram. Okay, so just like males have 2 testes, women have 2 ovaries. They're about the size and shape of almonds, and they sit on each side of the uterus. Both egg cells, known as ova, and they also produce our sex hormones. So they're not just producing the egg. So they produce the egg as well as the sex hormones, the primary one in females being estrogen. So within the ovary, there are thousands and thousands of follicles that consist of an immature egg, or an oocyte is another name for an immature egg. And so those the ovarian follicles are surrounded by follicular cells. So during our fetal period, the follicles evolve, and under this time they go through division, almost kind of mitotic division or mitosis, similar to the start of our spermatogenesis. And so this is, and when I say the fetal period, I don't mean the fetal period of the baby. I mean the fetal period of females. So when you were in your mother's womb, this is already occurring. So during our fetal period, they undergo mitosis, and then the first phase of meiosis. And then development kind of halts until a female hits puberty. So as a fetus, we have division, both mitosis, which is kind of normal cell division, and meiosis, which is that special sex cell division that occurs to kind of prepare the ovaries and oocytes and follicles for when a woman goes through puberty. So then we get through puberty when the menstrual cycle develops. And so there's a hormone known as FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And so that will prompt not all the follicles, but several follicles to resume meiosis. The follicle will develop further, kind of migrate towards the surface of the ovary. And then typically only one follicle will fully mature and get all the way to the surface. So there it's going to form what is known as, they consider it a fluid-filled blister known as a Graafian follicle. You do not have to memorize that term, Graafian follicle. That is a fluid-filled, that's kind of the mature follicle, fluid-filled blister. That's going to contain our oocyte. This follicle is then going to burst. So this here would be our Graafian follicle, and that is the ovulated follicle, ovulated oocyte. So it bursts out of the follicle. That will release the egg, and this is known as ovulation. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that term before, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's talk about the internal genitalia of the female. Sorry guys, my laptop's being a little funky today. So there's a few different portions of the fallopian tubes and uterus themselves. So the fallopian tubes can also be referred to as uterine tubes. They're about 4 inches long, and they carry or extend from the ovary to the uterus. This isthmus here, that's the most narrow portion of the fallopian tube, and it's closest to the uterus. This middle portion of our tube is known as the ampulla. Typically inside of the ampulla is where egg fertilization will take place. We also have what's known as the infundibulum. That's the distal kind of opening here. It doesn't necessarily attach directly to the ovary. That's why these fimbriae or finger-like projections exist as kind of a fan over top of the ovary. And so then the egg ends up getting released into the infundibulum, travels up to the ampulla. The ampulla is where fertilization will occur, and then travels through the isthmus to reach the uterus. So our uterus has a lot of muscle, you can see, very muscular wall. It's going to house and supply nutrients to a growing embryo. And so the uterus sits between our urinary bladder and the rectum, and it's held place by the broad ligament. Usually the uterus is going to tilt forward over the bladder a bit. So that is part of the reason why when women are pregnant, especially as their baby grows, they have to go to the bathroom much more often, because the uterus is actually putting pressure directly on the bladder. So our uterus also has a few different parts. The fundus is this upper portion here, this rounded upper portion, and then the body is going to be this main portion of the uterus. And then we have the inferior end of the uterus, which is the cervix. And so the cervical canal is the passageway through the cervix, and it links our uterus to the vagina. So the vagina, again, has a lot of muscle. It serves, obviously, as a receptacle for the penis and sperm, and it's also the route of discharge during menstruation. So the lower end of our vagina contains vaginal rugae. If you remember the term rugae, the last time we talked about it was in the stomach, the folds that allow it to expand. It has the same role here in the vagina. It has rugae that are folds, and during sex, they will expand. Another thing to highlight, ooh, it's going crazy, guys. I'm sorry. Another thing to highlight here is the hymen, and that's a fold of the mucous membrane that partially covers the entrance to the vagina. You do not see it on this diagram itself. So during the very first time a woman has intercourse, the hymen ruptures, and so that can sometimes produce blood. However, there's a lot of things that can actually tear through that hymen before sex. In the way olden days, that used to be kind of what they would check to see if a woman was still a virgin. But just wanted to highlight because that is highlighted in your book as well. One last piece to highlight here is that the vagina actually extends just past the uterus, or sorry, the cervix itself, and creates a couple little pockets. Those are known as fornices. I just wanted to point that out since that's in the diagram as well, but not anything you need to worry about too much. You'll also see in the uterus, there's a few different layers to the walls, the perimetrium, endometrium, and myometrium, and we'll talk about those in a couple slides. Okay, this is just kind of the written version of what we just discussed, more or less. So I went through it on the diagram, but here is a way to look at it on paper. Okay, as I said, the wall of the uterus has a few different layers. We have our perimetrium, the outer layer, that's the serous membrane. Our myometrium, that's the muscle layer. Anytime you see the word myo, you can think muscle. That's our middle layer. And then the endometrium is the inner layer. And that actually has kind of two different layers to it within itself. So the stratum functionalis is what actually sloughs off or is recycled during menstruation. And then the stratum basilis is what attaches our endometrium to the myometrium. So it's not the entire endometrium that is released during the menstrual cycle. It's just the stratum functionalis, and you should know the difference between those two. Okay, the external genitalia itself, we have the mons pubis. That is the upper portion, typically covered in adipose tissue and hair, and that's going to overlay the symphysis pubis or the pubic symphysis, which is the kind of part of the pelvis that you can palpate if you're kind of just above your penis or vagina and just below the waistline, kind of the two halves of the bones there. The labia majora are the thick folds of skin and adipose tissue that are on kind of this outer portion. And then you have the labia minora, which are thinner, and they're the folds inside of the labia majora. Okay, so this is a question about the uterus. What is the curved upper portion called? Is it the infundibulum, the fimbriae, the vestibule, or the fundus? That is the fundus. Remember, the infundibulum, that's that opening to the fallopian tube next to the ovary. The fimbriae extend from that infundibulum. That's the finger-like projections that actually kind of fan out around our ovary. And the vestibule is an area inside of the labia. Okay, also talking about breasts, obviously a very important portion of the female reproductive system. So each breast is going to contain 15 to 20 lobules. So the lobules, sorry, I'm trying to get my cursor back. The lobules are these guys here. And so they're going to be separated by fibrous tissue and adipose tissue. So some connective tissue and some fat tissue. So each lobule is going to contain sacs known as acini, and they secrete our milk. So that's very important to know. The acini sacs will create our milk. So there's really tiny ducts that drain the acini, and they merge to form larger ducts known as the lactiferous ducts. So each lobe has one lactiferous duct. Multiple, very many acini, clusters of acini, but they all merge to form one larger lactiferous duct. And before reaching the nipple, the ducts are going to enlarge a little bit more, and that will form our lactiferous sinuses. And then each duct ends in a tiny opening on the surface of the areola, which is the medical term for the nipple. So the pigmented area called the areola actually encircles the nipple. Numerous sebaceous glands, they're kind of like small bumps, will dot the surface, and sebum from these glands actually lubricate the areola, and that helps prevent dryness and cracking during nursing. There's suspensory ligaments that help support our breasts, and they also serve to attach the breast to the underlying pectoral muscles. Okay, the female reproductive cycle. We can go super in detail on this, but we're going to do more of the overview. But the female reproductive cycle has a lot of different parts to it, a lot of different hormone changes. And on page 477, there's a really, really good diagram that goes with this. We're going to go over it on the next slide as well, but this is kind of the start here. So the ovarian cycle is actually the changing within the ovaries. So what we talked about a few slides ago in terms of our follicle development into the Giffarian follicle, and further on into the corpus luteum, and when it's actually attached to the uterine wall. So the menstrual cycle focuses more on the changes in the uterus. So the ovarian cycle centers on changes in the ovaries. Menstrual cycle focuses on changes in the uterus. So the reproductive cycle averages 28 days in length, although it is very normal to have one that is shorter than 28 days or longer than 28 days. What is considered abnormal to a point is if you're based on individuals, if you have one that's 20 days and then one that's 45 days and then one that's 28 days, in general, females should have kind of consistent length of cycle, but it will vary by individuals. So both cycles are controlled by the cyclical secretion of hormones. Hormones are really the messenger or the mastermind behind what happens within the body. So as we talked about earlier, the follicle stimulating hormone has a very large role in the ovarian cycle, as well as luteinizing hormone. And then for the menstrual cycle itself, it is more under the influence of estrogen, which is our primary female sex hormone, and progesterone, which is another very important one. Okay, so we're going to talk about the ovarian cycle itself first. So as we said, at birth, the female's ovaries already contain about 2 million eggs, also known as oocytes. So many of these oocytes are called primary follicles, and they degenerate during childhood. By the time we actually hit puberty, only about 400,000 remain. And think women ovulate on average fewer than 500 times. So even though we have a degeneration from 2 million to 400,000, there's still an abundance of oocytes for the amount of menstrual cycles. So the ovarian cycle is described in our table, and you'll see it includes the changes in our hormone levels as well. And so I don't need you to memorize this word by any means, but I would like you to understand a little bit of the differences in the phases and the hormones that kind of what happens with the hormones that trigger these stages or kind of are the highlight of the stages. So our follicular phase, we have the follicle is actually triggered and stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormone. And so, like we said, usually only one follicle will make it to maturity. And as it develops, it will secrete estrogen, which then stimulates the thickening of our endometrium. and small amount of progesterone. But the big thing, the follicular phase, is started with an increase in follicle stimulating hormone. We then go into ovulation, and that is going to be prompted by a spike in luteinizing hormone, or LH. And so what happens then is the finger-like projections, the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes, will kind of sweep across the ovary to catch that emerging oocyte from the Graafian follicle. We then move into the luteal phase, and so this is marked by a high level of progesterone, and that is going to be secreted by our corpus luteum. Let me go up a little bit. The corpus luteum, which is after the follicle has already released the oocyte. So, like I said, the corpus luteum is going to secrete a lot of progesterone, and that's going to continue the thickening of our endometrium. It's going to become more vascular so that it gets a better blood supply, and it is preparing for pregnancy. And so these high levels of progesterone and estrogen also inhibit our pituitary gland from continuing to produce FSH and LH, so that we don't continue developing follicles when we're focusing on the one that we're preparing to get pregnant. So FSH and LH are super important in actually getting the follicle to maturity and getting it to release and implant on the uterine wall, but we don't want to continue that process. So that is another example of a negative feedback system. And we finally get to menstruation itself, which we will start on the next slide. So the menstrual cycle starts with the first day of bleeding. That's considered the menstrual phase, or the start of the menstrual phase. It then goes through the proliferative phase, where we have a further increase in estrogen and an additional growth of the blood vessels. So then we reach the ovulatory, or ovulation, where they're going to have the secretory phase, where increases in progesterone, we're getting further endometrial thickening, and then the premenstrual phase, where we get a decrease in progesterone, and that's when you get that ischemic endometrium, or additional bleeding, and it's going to shed that endometrial lining if fertilization does not occur. So again, the ovulatory cycle is occurring within the menstrual cycle. So that menstrual cycle lasts on average about 28 days, where the ovulation, or the ovulatory cycle, is really more of that first 14 days, with ovulation being relatively right in the middle of that. So again, when we very first start bleeding, that's the start of the menstrual phase. We're going to get an increase in estrogen, blood vessel growth, ovulation occurs. We then get to the secretory phase with an increase in progesterone, increase in endometrial thickening. That is triggered by the release of progesterone by the corpus luteum. Then the premenstrual phase, the progesterone starts to go down. If there's no fertilization that occurs, we end up having an ischemic endometrium, where that kind of the top part, or the top layer, is going to shed. Okay, so a surge in which hormone causes ovulation? So this is a little bit of a loaded question, but I think you guys will get it. So A, FSH, B, LH, C, estrogen, or D, progesterone? So the answer is LH. So FSH stimulates the development of the ovarian follicles. We then get a peak in our estrogen levels, and that triggers the release of our LH, and that's actually what ends up causing ovulation. The follicle stimulating hormone is necessary because we need the oocyte to be released from the follicle, but true ovulation occurs with the luteinizing hormone. We then get the corpus luteum implants itself on the uterine wall. It secretes a whole lot of progesterone that allows the wall to thicken and become more vascular. And then if that corpus luteum is not fertilized, the endometrium, or the top portion of the endometrium, will end up shedding. And that is the end of our slideshow. So I tried to highlight a few different things throughout here. Like I said, I will be sending out a study guide to go along with this chapter, and we only have one more lecture to go.